In the autumn of 1997, in a rural town in eastern Kentucky, a young teacher vanished without warning, and authorities were left with nothing. Nearly 2 decades later, one small detail reopened the case, and it exposed a dark secret no one was prepared for. The Appalachian Mountains of eastern Kentucky are known for their profound, isolated beauty. It is a region defined by steep, tree-covered ridges, winding roads that cut through deep valleys, and thick morning fog that settles heavily over the quiet towns. In the fall of 1997, the small community of Oakhaven was a place where everyone knew their neighbors, where the local high school football game was the biggest event of the week, and where doors were rarely locked at night. For 23-year-old Claire Bennett, Oakhaven was the perfect place to begin her absolute dream career. Claire was a bright, fiercely compassionate young woman who had just graduated from a state university with a degree in elementary education. She had a warm, deeply comforting smile, wavy brown hair, and an incredible reservoir of patience. Claire had wanted to be a teacher since she was a little girl. She believed that a classroom should be a safe haven, a place where every single child felt completely seen, valued, and protected. She had just been hired to teach the 6th grade at Oakhaven Middle School, a small, aging brick building situated near the edge of a dense forest. For weeks before the school year officially began, Claire spent her own meager savings buying colorful posters, books, and art supplies. She spent countless late nights in her empty classroom, arranging the wooden desks into welcoming circles and carefully cutting out bright paper decorations to tape to the cinderblock walls. Whenever Claire felt slightly nervous or overwhelmed by the massive responsibility of her new job, she had a tiny, highly distinct subconscious habit. She would gently rub her left thumb against her index finger. It was a nervous tic she had possessed since childhood, a quiet way to ground herself when her emotions ran high. On the morning of Tuesday, September 2nd, 1997, Claire stood nervously by the heavy wooden door of room 12. As the first warning bell rang, a stream of energetic, chaotic 11 and 12-year-old students poured into the hallway. From the very first moment she began to speak, Claire completely captivated her classroom. She didn't just read from a textbook. She knelt down next to their desks, asked them questions about their lives, and listened to them with an intense, genuine focus. In the back row sat a quiet, deeply shy 11-year-old boy named Ethan. Ethan came from a difficult home and rarely spoke in class. But when Claire noticed him looking at a book about fire trucks on her shelf, she quietly walked over, placed the book on his desk, and told him she knew he would do brave things one day. Ethan looked up at her, completely amazed that a teacher had actually noticed him. By the time the final bell rang at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Claire had already won the absolute loyalty of her students. As they packed their heavy backpacks and rushed toward the door, Claire stood at the front of the room, her heart incredibly full. She smiled brightly, waving to the children. "Have a wonderful night, everyone," Claire said, her voice filled with profound warmth. "I'll see you tomorrow." Absolutely no one in the room realized that those quiet, comforting words would become the most haunting, deeply painful memory of the entire school year. After the building slowly emptied, Claire decided to stay late. She wanted to finish decorating the back bulletin board so her students would feel even more welcome on their second day. She spent 2 hours cutting out colorful shapes, humming quietly to herself in the empty brick building. At exactly 5:30 in the evening, she grabbed a bright red paper apple she had carefully made, taped it securely to the top corner of the chalkboard, and finally grabbed her purse to leave. Claire walked out into the faculty parking lot. The bright, warm afternoon had completely vanished, rapidly replaced by a thick, heavy blanket of dark gray storm clouds rolling over the mountains. A sudden, unseasonable chill hung in the air, and the first few drops of a freezing autumn rain began to fall against the asphalt. Claire climbed into her reliable, older model sedan, turned the heater on, and began the 30-minute drive back to her small rental house on the outskirts of town. Her route took her down County Road 119, a narrow, deeply isolated stretch of two-lane blacktop that wound its way through a dense, towering pine forest. There were no streetlights, no houses, and absolutely no cellular phone towers in this part of the county. As Claire drove through the winding curves, the rain began to fall much harder, completely slicking the dark road and forcing her to slow down. About 15 miles outside of town, as her headlights cut through the heavy rain and the gathering twilight, Claire noticed something strange on the side of the road up ahead. Parked dangerously close to the deep, muddy ditch was an old, heavily rusted pickup truck. The truck's hood was not popped, and its hazard lights were not flashing. But as Claire's headlights washed over the edge of the dark tree line, her foot instinctively slammed down on the brake pedal. Standing entirely alone in the tall, wet grass, just a few feet away from the dark woods, was a little girl. She looked no older than 8. She was wearing a thin, soaking, wet yellow raincoat, shivering violently in the freezing autumn storm. Claire's heart immediately broke. As a deeply protective teacher, her absolute first instinct was to help a child in distress. She assumed the truck had broken down and the family was stranded in the dangerous, freezing weather. Claire pulled her sedan safely onto the gravel shoulder, leaving her engine running and her headlights illuminating the wet grass. She grabbed her heavy coat, pushed her car door open, and stepped out into the freezing, torrential rain. "Honey, are you okay?" Claire called out gently, raising her voice over the loud drumming of the rain. "Are you lost? Where are your parents?" The little girl did not speak. She simply stared at Claire, her eyes completely wide with an intense, paralyzing fear. Suddenly, the heavy brush at the edge of the tree line violently rustled. A tall, heavily built man stepped out of the dark woods. He was wearing a dark waterproof jacket, his face partially obscured by a soaked baseball cap. He walked quickly toward Claire, raising his hands in a seemingly apologetic gesture. "I'm so sorry to worry you, miss," the man said, his voice loud but strangely calm for the situation. "My truck just completely died on me. The alternator gave out. We've been standing out here freezing. I was just in the woods trying to find a dry piece of wood to put behind the tire so we don't roll into the ditch." Claire took a step back, the freezing rain soaking her hair. The man was smiling, but the smile did not reach his cold, dark eyes. Something about his incredibly calm demeanor in the middle of a freezing storm felt deeply, instinctively wrong. Claire looked past the man, making direct eye contact with the little girl in the yellow raincoat. The man took another step toward Claire. "If you could just give us a ride up to the gas station, we'd really appreciate it." Claire kept her eyes locked on the child. The little girl was not looking at the man she was supposed to belong to. She was staring directly at Claire, and very slowly, with an expression of absolute, primal terror, the little girl silently shook her head from side to side. "No." A massive, suffocating wave of pure adrenaline crashed over Claire. The child was not his daughter. She was being used as human bait to force a passing driver to stop. Claire instantly spun around, sprinting through the mud toward the open door of her idling sedan. She threw herself into the driver's seat, slamming the heavy door shut and violently locking it. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely grip the steering wheel. She reached for the gear shift, desperately trying to throw the car into drive and speed away. But as she looked up into her rearview mirror, a blinding pair of bright white high-beam headlights suddenly flared to life directly behind her. Another vehicle, completely blacked out in the storm, had quietly pulled out of a hidden logging trail. The heavy vehicle aggressively slammed into the rear bumper of Claire's sedan, completely blocking her from reveering and pinning her vehicle tightly against the steep, muddy ditch. Claire was entirely trapped. She reached frantically for the door handle, realizing the men were already approaching her window in the dark. Before we continue, if this story has kept you watching, please subscribe. Your support truly means a lot to us. At 7 o'clock the following morning, a local county sheriff's deputy was patrolling the quiet, rain-slicked curves of County Road 119. The massive thunderstorm had completely passed, leaving the Appalachian Mountains covered in a thick, eerie white fog. As the deputy rounded a sharp curve, he spotted a vehicle sitting awkwardly on the gravel shoulder, its front right tire resting dangerously close to the muddy ditch. The deputy pulled his cruiser over and turned on his flashing blue lights. He ran the license plate through dispatch before stepping out of his vehicle. The car was registered to a young woman named Claire Bennett. The deputy walked cautiously up to the sedan, his hand resting on his service weapon. The driver's side door was standing wide open. The keys were still perfectly sitting in the ignition, and the battery had completely died because the headlights had been left on all night. Resting neatly on the passenger seat was a small leather purse and a stack of freshly graded 6th grade homework papers. But Claire was completely, entirely gone. Within 2 hours, the quiet, isolated county road was swarming with heavy law enforcement presence. The Kentucky State Police established a massive command center directly on the asphalt. The sheer terror of a beloved young school teacher vanishing into thin air sent a massive, paralyzing shockwave through the entire community of Oak Haven. The lead investigator assigned to the chaotic scene was Detective Arthur Vance. Vance was a highly respected, deeply methodical veteran who had spent decades navigating the complex, secretive nature of Appalachian crime. When Vance arrived at the abandoned vehicle, he immediately recognized the terrifying reality of the crime scene. There was absolutely no broken glass. There was no blood on the upholstery, and Claire's purse had not been emptied of cash. This was not a robbery gone wrong. It was a targeted, deeply coordinated abduction. But the massive, unyielding thunderstorm from the night before had acted as a perfect, natural eraser. The millions of gallons of torrential rain had completely washed the asphalt, the gravel, and the mud entirely clean. There were no strange tire tracks left behind by the predator's vehicle. There were no heavy footprints in the mud near the tree line. The heavy rain had destroyed absolutely every single microscopic piece of physical evidence. Vance ordered a massive search of the surrounding woods. Dozens of highly trained tracking dogs and heavily armed state troopers spent 3 agonizing days marching shoulder to shoulder through the dense, unforgiving pine forest. They searched abandoned hunting cabins, deep ravines, and muddy creeks, desperately calling Claire's name. They found absolutely nothing. The investigation quickly transitioned to the Oak Haven Middle School. Detectives sat down with the deeply traumatized faculty and students, desperately trying to trace Claire's exact timeline on her final day. Vance gently interviewed the children from room 12. Many of the 11-year-olds were crying, entirely unable to understand why their favorite teacher hadn't come back. But one deeply observant, frightened young student provided a crucial, highly suspicious detail. The young girl explained that during the last hour of the school day, the classroom telephone had briefly rung. Claire had walked over to her desk and picked up the receiver. The student noted that Claire had only listened for about 20 seconds, but when she hung up the phone, her entire demeanor had completely changed. The warm, bright smile vanished. She looked incredibly worried, her face pale, and she had immediately begun rubbing her left thumb against her index finger with intense, nervous energy. Detective Vance immediately subpoenaed the incoming call records for the school's main switchboard. He discovered that an external call had indeed been routed to room 12 exactly at 2:15 in the afternoon. But when the phone company traced the origin of the call, the result completely paralyzed the investigation. The call had been placed from a public, coin-operated payphone located outside a busy, anonymous gas station nearly 40 miles away. The caller had left absolutely no name, and the gas station did not have any external security cameras. The identity of the person who had terrified Claire just hours before she vanished was completely, entirely untraceable. With the phone lead dead, the police forensic team meticulously processed Claire's abandoned sedan, hoping to find any hidden clue she might have left behind in her desperate final seconds. The forensic technicians carefully dusted the dashboard, the steering wheel, and the center console. While searching the driver's side floorboard, a technician found a small, crumpled yellow sticky note wedged tightly beneath the floor mat. The technician carefully uncrumpled the note using heavy tweezers. Written in Claire's distinct, looping handwriting were 3 bold letters and 2 numbers, JKL49. It was clearly a partial license plate number. Vance felt a massive surge of adrenaline. If Claire had been followed by a suspicious vehicle in the days leading up to her disappearance, she might have jotted down the partial plate, unknowingly documenting her own stalker. The technician placed the vital sticky note inside a clear plastic evidence bag, sealing it with bright red tape, and placed it inside a heavy cardboard evidence box sitting in the trunk of a police cruiser at the scene. But later that night, when the lead forensic examiner opened the evidence box back at the secure state police laboratory to formally log the items into the system, a massive, horrifying discovery was made. The sealed plastic bag was completely empty. The yellow sticky note with the partial license plate had been deliberately, meticulously removed. Vance was absolutely furious. He locked down the precinct, interrogating every single officer, technician, and deputy who had been at the crime scene. But in the chaotic swarm of the initial investigation, with dozens of people walking around the vehicles, it was entirely impossible to prove who had opened the box. Someone deeply embedded in the investigation, or someone who had gained access to the unsecure police cruiser, had actively destroyed the most critical piece of evidence in the entire case. The terrifying reality settled heavily over Detective Vance. Claire Bennett had not been taken by a random passing drifter. She had been taken by a highly organized predator, and that predator had a silent, invisible accomplice actively working to sabotage the police from the inside. The absolute, terrifying realization that someone had deliberately destroyed critical police evidence sent a shockwave of paranoia completely through Detective Arthur Vance. He stood inside the secure state police laboratory, staring at the empty plastic evidence bag. The yellow sticky note containing the partial license plate of the predator's vehicle was entirely gone. Vance immediately understood the deeply horrifying implication. The person who had taken Claire Bennett was not a passing drifter from out of state. It was someone highly embedded in the local community of Oakhaven. It was someone who had access to the chaotic crime scene on the morning the abandoned sedan was discovered. It could have been a local first responder, a trusted county official, or even one of the dozens of civilian volunteers who had brought hot coffee and blankets to the search parties. The predator was actively monitoring the investigation from the inside, flawlessly destroying the single clue that could have led the authorities directly to his front door. Despite Vance's furious efforts to interrogate everyone who had been near the command center, the truth remained completely hidden in the shadows. The local sheriff's department was deeply shaken, and a thick, heavy blanket of distrust settled over the entire town. Without the partial license plate, and with the heavy rain having completely washed away any tire tracks, the investigation rapidly began to lose its initial momentum. Weeks turned into months. The bitter, freezing winter of 1997 descended heavily over the Appalachian Mountains, completely covering the dense pine forests in thick layers of white snow. The bright yellow missing person flyers taped to the storefronts in Oakhaven began to fade and tear in the harsh winter wind. And then, exactly 4 months after Claire vanished, the agonizing silence of the region was suddenly, violently shattered. Just 50 miles away from Oakhaven, in a neighboring rural county, another young woman completely disappeared. Her name was Megan, a 24-year-old nurse who was driving home from a late-night shift at the local hospital. Her vehicle was found abandoned on a quiet, highly isolated stretch of highway, just inches away from a snowy ditch. The driver's side door was standing wide open, the engine was completely cold, and her purse was sitting untouched on the passenger seat. The exact, flawless signature of the crime immediately triggered a massive alarm for Detective Vance. The predator had struck again. The authorities officially merged the two cases, realizing with absolute, terrifying certainty that they were hunting a highly organized, deeply calculated serial offender who was targeting young, compassionate women on isolated mountain roads. A massive, multi-county task force was immediately established. The police heavily increased rural patrols, and the local news stations ran continuous, desperate warnings for women not to drive entirely alone at night. But the phantom predator had once again vanished without leaving a single microscopic piece of physical evidence behind. But this time the monster made a single, incredibly rare mistake. 6 agonizing days after Megan was taken, a long-haul truck driver was traveling down a heavily wooded, freezing mountain pass just before dawn. As the massive headlights of his truck swept across the icy asphalt, he saw a fragile figure stumbling wildly out of the dark tree line. It was Megan. She was severely frostbitten, wearing only a thin hospital scrub top and torn jeans, completely shivering and highly traumatized. She had somehow managed to slip a heavy metal padlock while her captor was away, escaping into the freezing winter night and running blindly through the dark woods for miles until she reached the highway. Megan was rushed to the nearest trauma center, heavily protected by a massive perimeter of state troopers. Detective Vance arrived at the hospital just hours later, sitting gently beside her bed, desperate to learn absolutely anything about the man who had taken her, praying she could lead them directly to Claire. But as Megan softly wept, wrapped tightly in heavy, warm blankets, she revealed a deeply terrifying reality about the kidnapper's methodology. She explained that she had absolutely no idea what the man looked like, and she had no idea where she had been held. The predator had kept her completely, permanently blindfolded from the absolute second she was taken. She had been locked inside a small, freezing room that smelled heavily of damp earth and old, rotting wood. She believed it was a subterranean root cellar or a heavily reinforced basement. But she provided Detective Vance with one single, incredibly specific acoustic detail that completely changed the entire trajectory of the investigation. Megan told the detective that, although she could not see the outside world, the room she was held in was not entirely soundproof. Every single weekday morning, exactly at 10:30, the heavy, dead silence of her dark prison was broken by a very specific, echoing noise coming from the distance. She heard the loud, unmistakable sound of dozens of children playing and laughing. It was the clear, distinct sound of a school playground during morning recess. Detective Vance felt a massive, electric jolt of pure adrenaline shoot completely through his chest. The predator was hiding his victims in an abandoned rural structure located directly within the acoustic radius of a local elementary or middle school. Vance rushed back to the command center and threw a massive topographical map of the Tri-County area onto the main conference table. He ordered his team to place a red pushpin on the exact location of every single public school, private academy, and rural church daycare in the entire region. He brought in a highly specialized acoustic forensics expert from the state capitol. The expert analyzed the dense, mountainous terrain, explaining that depending on the heavy winter wind patterns and the shape of the mountain valleys, the echoing sound of children playing could clearly travel up to 1.5 miles away. Vance drew a strict 1.5-mile circle around every single red pushpin on the map. He assembled a massive tactical search grid, focusing entirely on abandoned farms, old dilapidated barns, and empty properties sitting inside those specific acoustic zones. For 3 intense, exhausting weeks, heavily armed police units kicked down the doors of dozens of rotting wooden sheds and overgrown rural cellars. They found old tractors, collapsed roofs, and empty silos, but every single lead ended in absolute, crushing disappointment. The predator, realizing that Megan had escaped and could potentially identify the location, had completely sanitized his holding cell. By the time the police finally searched an old, abandoned dairy farm located just a mile behind a rural elementary school, the basement had been heavily bleached, and absolutely no trace of Claire or Megan was left behind. The massive, highly promising lead slowly dissolved into nothing. The predator had flawlessly adapted, moving his invisible prison deeper into the shadows, completely out of the reach of the authorities. With the physical search areas completely exhausted, the agonizing, heavy reality of a cold case finally settled over the town of Oakhaven. The state police slowly withdrew their massive resources, transferring the detectives to active homicides in the larger cities. For Claire's parents, Robert and Mary Bennett, the transition into a cold case was an absolute, suffocating nightmare. They were kind, hardworking people who loved their daughter with a fierce, unconditional intensity. When the police officially scaled back the investigation, Robert and Mary completely refused to accept that Claire was gone. They absolutely refused to sell their small, beautiful home on the edge of town, entirely convinced that if they moved, Claire would not know where to find them when she finally escaped. They kept her childhood bedroom exactly the way she had left it on the morning of September 2nd. Her books remained perfectly lined up on the shelves, and her winter coats hung neatly in the closet. And every single night, as the sun dipped below the Appalachian Mountains and the deep darkness settled over the town, Mary Bennett would walk to the front door and flip the switch for the bright yellow porch light. She left the light burning through the rain, the snow, and the heavy mountain fog. She left it on every single birthday, every single Christmas, and every single ordinary Tuesday, desperately holding onto a fragile, beautiful thread of hope that the bright light would eventually guide her daughter back out of the dark. Years slowly began to pass. The heavy, unyielding weight of time buried the initial shock of the disappearance under layers of dust and fading memories. The late 1990s rapidly transitioned into the completely new era of the 2000s. The children who had sat in room 12 on Claire's very first day of teaching slowly grew up. They graduated from high school, moved away to college, and started families of their own. But many of them never completely forgot the warm, incredibly patient young woman who had made them feel so deeply valued on a single autumn afternoon. Among those students was Ethan, the quiet, highly shy 11-year-old boy who had been completely amazed when Claire handed him the book about fire trucks. Ethan had taken her gentle encouragement directly to heart. He had grown into a tall, fiercely dedicated, and highly respected professional firefighter, working for a massive emergency response department in a neighboring state. He possessed a brilliant, observant mind, trained to notice the smallest, most critical details in highly chaotic environments. Before we continue, if this story has kept you watching, please subscribe. Your support truly means a lot to us. Although nearly 2 decades had passed since the tragic autumn of 1997, Detective Arthur Vance, now heavily grayed and slowly approaching retirement, completely refused to let the unsolved mystery go. He still kept a thick, heavy binder containing all the original crime scene photographs locked inside his desk drawer. Late one quiet evening, sitting alone in his dimly lit office, Vance slowly flipped through the old glossy photographs taken on the morning Claire's sedan was discovered on the muddy shoulder of County Road 119. He was desperately trying to solve the agonizing puzzle of the missing yellow sticky note. He knew the person who stole the partial license plate had to be captured directly in the background of those chaotic images. Vance pulled out a heavy magnifying glass and began meticulously scanning the faces of the dozens of people standing near the police cruisers that morning. There were uniformed deputies, local news reporters, and concerned citizens who had stopped to help. But as Vance moved the heavy glass over a specific photograph taken near the trunk of the primary evidence vehicle, he noticed a highly suspicious, deeply troubling detail that he had completely missed 19 years ago. Standing just inches away from the unsecure police cruiser, holding a thermos of hot coffee, was a man the entire community deeply loved and trusted. He was a highly respected local volunteer, a man who organized the town's charity drives and had publicly, loudly led the massive civilian search parties through the woods to find Claire. In the photograph, the volunteer was not looking at the abandoned sedan in the ditch. He was looking directly at the heavy cardboard evidence box sitting in the open trunk of the cruiser, and his hand was resting perfectly, quietly on the edge of the bumper, just inches away from the sealed plastic bags. Vance felt a massive, terrifying chill wash completely over his chest. The most dangerous predator in Oakhaven had not been hiding in the dark woods. He had been standing right in the bright sunlight, completely masking his horrific crimes behind a flawless, trusted smile. The chilling discovery of the respected local volunteer standing directly next to the open evidence box completely paralyzed Detective Arthur Vance. He sat in his dimly lit office, staring at the glossy photograph under the heavy magnifying glass, a sickening feeling of profound betrayal washing over him. The volunteer, a man who had publicly wept on local television, organized community prayer vigils, and led hundreds of people through the dark woods to search for Claire, had been actively monitoring the police from the very beginning. But despite Vance's brilliant, horrifying realization, his hands were completely tied by the rigid constraints of the law. A 19-year-old photograph of a man standing near a police cruiser was highly suspicious, but it was absolutely not physical proof of a crime. Without the missing sticky note, without the predator's vehicle, and without Claire, Vance had no legal grounds to secure an arrest warrant. He quietly opened a shadow file on the volunteer, watching his movements for years, desperately waiting for the man to make a single, careless mistake. But the mistake never came. The volunteer lived a quiet, normal life, heavily protected by his flawless reputation in the small town of Oakhaven. The heavy, agonizing weight of time slowly buried the investigation. 19 long years passed. The late 1990s faded into history, entirely replaced by the modern era of high-speed digital media and global internet access. For the vast majority of the community, the tragic story of the young teacher who vanished after her very first day became a dark, distant local legend. Most people firmly believed Claire Bennett was no longer alive. But inside a massive, bustling fire station located in a large metropolitan city 2 states away, there was a man who had absolutely never forgotten her. Ethan, the quiet, deeply shy 11-year-old boy who had sat in the back row of room 12, was now a 30-year-old professional firefighter. He had grown into a tall, broad-shouldered man with a deeply compassionate heart. He had taken Claire's gentle words of encouragement on that single autumn afternoon and used them to completely define the trajectory of his entire life. He had spent his career running into burning buildings, dedicating himself to saving others exactly the way Claire had tried to save the little girl on the dark mountain road. On a quiet, rainy Thursday afternoon in the fall of 2016, Ethan was sitting in the firehouse kitchen, eating lunch with his crew. A small television mounted on the wall was playing a live, viral local news broadcast. A massive, historic flood had recently devastated parts of southern Ohio, and the news crew was interviewing volunteers at a heavily crowded disaster relief shelter. Ethan was casually watching the screen as the reporter spoke into the microphone. Behind the reporter, dozens of people were rapidly sorting through massive cardboard boxes of donated clothing and bottled water. The news camera slowly panned across the crowded gymnasium. For exactly 3 seconds, An older woman carrying a heavy stack of folded blankets walked directly through the background of the shot. Ethan completely froze. He dropped his fork, the metal clattering loudly against his ceramic plate. He stood up so quickly his chair violently scraped against the linoleum floor, completely startling the other firefighters in the room. Ethan ran to the television. He grabbed the remote control and frantically pressed the rewind button on the digital cable box. He paused the high-definition broadcast exactly when the older woman walked into the frame. She looked deeply weathered and exhausted. Her wavy brown hair was heavily streaked with gray, and she was wearing a faded, oversized sweatshirt. She was 19 years older, but Ethan recognized the gentle, deeply familiar shape of her face instantly. The memory of the kind teacher handing him the book about fire trucks rushed back with a staggering, undeniable clarity. It was Claire Bennett. Ethan did not wait for his shift to end. He immediately walked into his captain's office, asked for an emergency leave, and pulled out his cellular phone. He dialed the Kentucky State Police Cold Case Unit, aggressively demanding to speak with the lead detective in charge of the 1997 Oakhaven disappearance. When the call was finally routed to Arthur Vance, the old detective was incredibly skeptical. Vance was now deeply retired, working only as a civilian consultant. He listened to the frantic young firefighter on the phone, his voice heavy with years of accumulated disappointment. "Son, I understand you care about her," Vance said quietly. "But it has been 19 years. The mind plays tricks. Dozens of people have called in over the decades claiming they saw Claire in grocery stores and restaurants. It is incredibly common to see a ghost when you are desperately looking for one." Ethan fiercely refused to back down. He told the old detective that this was absolutely not a trick of the mind. He emailed the high-definition video clip directly to Vance and told him to look very closely at the woman's hands. Ethan explained that on the very first day of the 6th grade, he had watched his new teacher stand at the front of the classroom. He noticed that whenever she looked slightly nervous or overwhelmed by the noise of the students, she would unconsciously, rapidly rub her left thumb against her index finger. It was a tiny, incredibly specific subconscious habit. Vance opened the digital video file on his computer monitor. He watched the older woman walk through the background of the flooded gymnasium. She looked slightly startled by the bright lights of the television crew. She stopped walking for just a fraction of a second, looking nervously at the camera. And then, clear as day, she raised her left hand. She rapidly, unconsciously rubbed her left thumb heavily against her index finger. The breath completely left Vance's lungs in a heavy, agonizing rush. It was a highly specific behavioral coping mechanism that a person simply could not fake, and a habit she had absolutely never forgotten. Within 4 hours, Vance was on a state police helicopter flying directly toward the disaster relief shelter in southern Ohio. He coordinated a massive, highly quiet operation with the local Ohio authorities. They did not want to storm the shelter and trigger a chaotic panic. They needed to approach her gently. Vance walked into the busy, echoing gymnasium wearing plain clothes. He slowly navigated through the massive piles of donated clothing, his heart pounding a frantic, deafening rhythm against his ribs. He finally spotted her. She was kneeling on the floor, quietly sorting a box of children's winter coats. Vance walked up and gently called out the name she had been born with, Claire. The woman did not flinch. She did not look up in shock. She slowly finished folding a small blue coat, placed it into the box, and then calmly stood up to face the older man. She looked directly into Vance's eyes. Her expression was completely blank, totally devoid of any recognition or fear. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice incredibly soft and polite. "My name is Grace Miller. I think you have me confused with someone else." Vance stared at her, deeply unsettled by her absolute, chilling calm. He gently pulled his retired police badge from his jacket and explained that they believed she was a missing school teacher from eastern Kentucky. The woman simply shook her head, offering a small, polite smile. She calmly insisted that she had lived in Ohio her entire life. She claimed she had never been to the Appalachian Mountains, and she had absolutely never been a teacher. She spoke with a terrifyingly flawless conviction. Vance knew he could not simply arrest a woman for looking like a missing person from 2 decades ago. He needed absolute, undeniable scientific proof. While the local Ohio police distracted Grace by asking her routine questions about the flood donations, Vance quietly retrieved a plastic water bottle she had just been drinking from. He sealed the bottle inside a sterile evidence bag and rushed it directly to a rapid response forensic laboratory. He requested an emergency, expedited DNA comparison, running the saliva on the bottle against the genetic profiles of Robert and Mary Bennett, which had been securely stored in the national database since 1997. 24 agonizing hours later, the laboratory director called Vance directly. The genetic markers did not just indicate a familial connection. It was an absolute, undisputed, 100% match. The woman claiming to be Grace Miller was, completely and undeniably, Claire Bennett. Vance returned to the disaster shelter with a team of female detectives and a highly trained forensic psychologist. They quietly escorted Claire into a private, secure administrative office away from the crowds. Vance gently laid the official DNA results directly onto the table in front of her. He spoke with profound compassion, assuring her that she was completely safe, that the nightmare was officially over, and that they were ready to take her back home to her parents, who had kept her porch light on for 19 years. Claire looked at the DNA paperwork. She did not cry. She did not break down in relief. She pushed the paper back across the table, her hands shaking slightly. "The test is wrong," she whispered, her voice tightening with a deeply hidden, paralyzing panic. "I am Grace Miller. I belong here. Please, you have to let me go back to work." The sheer psychological dissonance of the moment was completely terrifying. The detectives were completely bewildered. Why would a kidnapping victim, presented with undeniable scientific proof of her own identity, actively refuse to be rescued? The forensic psychologist asked Vance to step out of the room. After spending 2 hours gently speaking with Claire, the psychologist emerged into the hallway, her face completely pale. The psychologist explained the horrifying reality of Claire's mental state. She was not lying to the police to protect herself. She was a victim of severe, profound psychological conditioning. 19 years of absolute trauma, total isolation, and highly methodical emotional manipulation had entirely shattered her original identity. The predator had completely broken her mind, replacing her reality with a deeply constructed delusion. The psychologist warned Vance that Claire firmly believed that acknowledging her true name, or attempting to return to her family, would trigger a catastrophic, violent event. She had been thoroughly convinced by her captor that returning home would put innocent people in severe, immediate danger. She was denying her identity not because she wanted to remain Grace Miller, but because she was actively, desperately trying to protect the people she loved from a monster the police could not see. Before we continue, if this story has kept you watching, please subscribe. Your support truly means a lot to us. To safely dismantle the massive, invisible psychological walls holding her captive, the authorities needed to understand exactly how the predator was still controlling her from the shadows. They quietly moved Claire into a highly secure, comfortable safe house, monitoring her behavior around the clock through hidden cameras, hopping to identify her triggers. For the first few days, Claire's routine was incredibly quiet. She read books, ate her meals, and spoke politely with the female detectives. But as the investigative team closely monitored the video feeds, they noticed a deeply disturbing, highly specific behavioral anomaly. Every single afternoon, without fail, As the clock on the wall approached 3:55, Claire's entire demeanor would completely change. The calm, polite facade would instantly vanish. She would begin to sweat, her breathing would become rapid and shallow, and she would aggressively rub her left thumb against her index finger. And then, at exactly 4 o'clock in the afternoon, absolute, primal terror would completely take over her body. She would stop whatever she was doing, walk slowly toward the nearest window in the safe house, and pull the curtains back just a fraction of an inch. She would stand there, completely paralyzed by fear, staring intensely out into the street. She would watch the empty road for exactly 10 minutes, as if she were desperately expecting someone terrifying to arrive. When 4:10 passed and no one appeared, the sheer panic would slowly recede. She would close the curtain, sit back down, and the deeply hidden terror would vanish until the next afternoon. Detective Vance watched the surveillance footage, a massive chill running directly down his spine. 4 o'clock in the afternoon was exactly 1 hour after the final school bell rang at Oakhaven Middle School. It was the precise time Claire would have normally arrived home from work 19 years ago. She wasn't just suffering from lingering trauma. Someone was actively keeping that specific terror alive. Someone was still maintaining contact, pulling the invisible psychological strings to ensure she never, ever forgot that she was constantly being watched. The terrifying realization that Claire was still being actively monitored completely consumed Detective Arthur Vance. He sat in the dimly lit observation room of the safe house, watching the video monitor as Claire slowly stepped away from the window at 4:10 in the afternoon. The acute, paralyzing terror slowly faded from her face, replaced once again by the quiet, polite facade of Grace Miller. Vance knew that psychological conditioning of this magnitude required consistent, reinforced contact. If Claire had been living independently in Ohio, working at a disaster relief shelter, the predator had to have a way of continuously reaching her to maintain the invisible walls of her prison. While Claire was sleeping that night, heavily monitored by a female deputy, Vance quietly entered her small bedroom and retrieved the faded canvas duffel bag she had brought from the shelter. He put on a pair of latex gloves and meticulously emptied the contents onto a table. There were a few oversized sweaters, a toothbrush, and a worn pair of jeans. But as Vance ran his hands along the thick canvas lining at the bottom of the bag, he felt a stiff, rigid square hidden beneath the fabric. He carefully used a pocket knife to slice the stitching. He reached into the hidden compartment and pulled out a small, tightly bound stack of envelopes. There were exactly 19 envelopes. They were all completely identical. They were made of thick, high-quality cream paper, and none of them had a return address. There were no postal stamps, meaning they had never been sent through the official mail system. They had been hand-delivered, slipped quietly into her life when she wasn't looking. Vance carefully opened the top envelope using a pair of tweezers. Inside was a simple, beautifully printed Christmas greeting card. It depicted a quiet, snowy winter scene. But when Vance opened the card, the breath completely left his lungs. There was no signature. There was no festive holiday message. Printed in elegant, dark black ink directly in the center of the card was a single, terrifyingly simple sentence. "Good girls keep promises." Vance opened the next card. It contained the exact same sentence. He opened all 19 cards, spanning 19 years of holidays, and every single one carried the exact same chilling message. It was a masterclass in psychological torture. The predator didn't need to physically threaten her. He didn't need to brandish a weapon or lock her in a basement anymore. He simply needed to remind her, once a year, that he knew exactly where she was. The cards were a permanent, silent tether, ensuring that the terrifying promise she had made all those years ago remained the absolute center of her reality. Vance immediately bagged the 19 envelopes and drove aggressively through the night, hand-delivering them to the State Police Forensics Laboratory. He demanded a massive, microscopic analysis of the paper, the ink, and the adhesive. The forensic technicians worked for 48 agonizing hours. The cards yielded absolutely no fingerprints, and the envelopes contained no trace DNA. The sender was incredibly careful, likely wearing gloves and sealing the envelopes with a damp sponge rather than their tongue. But the forensic analysts found one massive, critical vulnerability. The cards were not mass-produced by a large commercial greeting card company. They were custom-printed on a highly specific, heavyweight cardstock using an older, commercial-grade offset printing press. By analyzing the microscopic spray patterns of the ink and the precise cutting angle of the paper, the technicians traced the manufacturing origin of the cards. They had been printed by a small, independent printing shop located in a rural town in eastern Kentucky, just 10 miles away from Oak Haven. Vance immediately flew back to Kentucky. When he arrived at the address of the printing shop, he found a completely empty, boarded-up storefront. The business had officially closed its doors nearly 5 years ago. But Vance refused to hit another dead end. He ran the property records through the county courthouse and tracked down the former owner of the print shop, a 70-year-old man named Thomas, who was now living quietly in a nearby retirement community. Vance visited Thomas in his small apartment. He laid the 19 custom Christmas cards across the kitchen table. Thomas adjusted his reading glasses, staring at the snowy winter scene and the chilling, single-sentence message. A look of deep, unsettling recognition slowly washed over the old printer's face. Thomas nodded heavily. He perfectly remembered the order. It was highly unusual because the customer had come into the shop years ago and ordered a massive, bulk batch of the exact same custom card, paying for the entire expensive order entirely in cash. When Vance asked for a physical description of the customer, his heart began to pound a frantic, deafening rhythm against his ribs. Thomas described a tall, well-spoken man with a warm, deeply trusted smile. He didn't know the man's exact name, but he told Detective Vance that he recognized the customer because he was a prominent local figure. He was the man who had organized the massive community charity drives. He was the man who had been all over the local television news in 1997, loudly leading the civilian search parties to find the missing school teacher. The description was a flawless, undeniable match. It was the highly respected local volunteer, the exact same man Vance had spotted in the 19-year-old photograph, resting his hand on the police cruiser directly next to the open evidence box. The terrifying, agonizing suspicion that had haunted Detective Vance for nearly 2 decades was finally, absolutely confirmed by physical evidence. The volunteer was deeply, intimately connected to the abduction. He was the one who had stolen the yellow sticky note, deliberately blinding the police. And he was the one who had been secretly tracking Claire across state lines, hand-delivering the terrifying Christmas cards to ensure her psychological prison remained completely impenetrable. But the volunteer was not the man who had stepped out of the dark woods on County Road 119. Claire had described her abductor as a large, rough-looking man wearing a soaked baseball cap. The volunteer was much smaller, with a completely different physical build. He was not the primary kidnapper. He was the invisible accomplice, operating completely in the bright sunlight. Vance immediately drove to the state police archives and pulled the original 1997 investigation file. He flipped furiously through the heavy stacks of paper, pulling out the volunteer's official alibi for September 2nd. The alibi appeared completely airtight. The volunteer had been working as a mid-level manager at a local manufacturing plant on the day Claire vanished. He had provided signed affidavits from his coworkers and his immediate supervisor, stating that he had been in his office the entire afternoon. The original detectives had officially cleared him within the first week of the investigation. But Vance knew that a clever manipulator could easily forge an alibi in a small town where everyone trusted him. Vance secured a covert search warrant and raided the heavily archived, dusty storage basement of the manufacturing plant. He spent 10 exhausting hours digging through hundreds of boxes of rotting corporate paperwork from 1997. He finally found the original, handwritten employee punch cards and the daily security logs for September 2nd. When Vance compared the security log to the signed affidavits, a massive, fatal discrepancy completely shattered the volunteer's alibi. The security guard at the front gate had meticulously logged every vehicle leaving the property. At exactly 4:30 in the afternoon, just 1 hour before Claire left the middle school, the volunteer had quietly signed out, claiming he had an emergency dental appointment. He did not return to the manufacturing plant until 6:30 in the evening. He had secretly left work for exactly 2 hours. That 2-hour window perfectly aligned with the exact time Claire's sedan was forced off the dark, rainy mountain road. The volunteer had been driving the second, completely blacked-out vehicle. He was the man who had aggressively slammed into Claire's rear bumper, trapping her against the muddy ditch so the primary kidnapper could pull her out of the car. Vance quickly assembled a massive, highly secretive task force. They could not simply arrest the volunteer yet. If they tipped their hand too early, he would invoke his right to silence, and they would never find the physical location where Claire had been held for all those terrible years. They needed to find the original prison. Vance dug deeply into the volunteer's county property records. The volunteer owned a nice, suburban home in Oak Haven, but there was absolutely no way he had kept a captive woman hidden in a busy neighborhood. Vance expanded the search, looking into the volunteer's immediate family. He discovered that the volunteer had an older brother. The older brother was a massive, reclusive man with a long history of violent behavior who had lived entirely off the grid. He matched the physical description of the man in the woods perfectly. The older brother had officially died of a massive heart attack nearly 6 years ago, but he had owned a sprawling, heavily isolated 50-acre property deep in the Appalachian foothills, nearly 40 miles away from Oak Haven. The property was officially listed as abandoned, rotting away in the dense forest. At 4 o'clock in the morning, a massive convoy of blacked-out tactical police vehicles aggressively climbed the winding, unpaved mountain road leading to the deceased brother's property. They cut the heavy, rusted chains on the front gate and swarmed the property. The main farmhouse was completely dilapidated, the roof heavily caved in from years of harsh winter snow. But as the tactical team swept the dark property with heavy flashlights, they found a massive, heavily reinforced cinderblock outbuilding completely hidden behind a thick wall of overgrown pine trees. Vance walked up to the heavy steel door of the outbuilding. It was secured by a massive external deadbolt, completely rusted shut from years of exposure. The tactical team used a heavy battering ram to violently smash the steel door open. Vance stepped inside, shining his bright white tactical flashlight into the suffocating darkness. The air inside the building was incredibly stale, smelling heavily of damp concrete and old paper. As the beam of the flashlight swept across the room, the absolute, horrifying reality of Claire's 19-year nightmare was fully revealed. The cinderblock building was not a simple storage shed. It was a heavily constructed, subterranean holding cell. There was a small, rusted bed frame in the corner, a chemical toilet, and a single, heavily barred window placed high near the ceiling. But it was the objects scattered across the concrete floor that completely broke Detective Vance's heart. Pinned to the damp cinderblock walls, deeply faded and curling from years of moisture, were brightly colored paper apples, historical timeline posters, and dozens of educational visual aids. Sitting on a small, rusted metal desk in the center of the room were stacks of old, heavily worn 6th-grade reading books and a small, wooden cup filled with dried-out markers. They were the exact decorations and school supplies that had been completely missing from room 12 on the morning after Claire vanished. The predator had not just stolen Claire from the road. He had gone to the middle school in the middle of the night, stolen the contents of her classroom, and completely recreated a twisted, horrifying mockery of her beloved teaching environment inside the concrete prison. As Vance slowly walked through the silent, echoing cell, his boot brushed against something hidden beneath the rusted mattress of the bed. He knelt on the cold concrete and carefully pulled a small, heavily worn composition notebook from the shadows. It was a hidden diary. Claire had secretly written short, fragile entries over the many years she was held captive, hiding the notebook whenever she heard the heavy steel door unlatching. Vance opened the notebook, expecting to find detailed, desperate escape plans or angry, fierce declarations of survival. Instead, what he read completely shattered his understanding of human endurance, revealing a level of psychological control so utterly profound and deeply evil that it was difficult to comprehend. Claire had not written about running away. She had not written about breaking the window or attacking her captor. Page after page, year after year, written in shaking, terrified handwriting, Claire had repeatedly written one single, absolutely heartbreaking sentence. If I run, someone else will replace me. If I run, someone else will replace me. Vance stared at the pages, the heavy, agonizing truth completely washing over him. Claire was a deeply compassionate, fiercely protective young teacher. Her absolute first instinct in the world was to protect innocent children. She had stopped on that freezing mountain road because she thought a little girl was in danger. The predator had realized this immediately. He had exploited her greatest virtue and weaponized her own beautiful heart against her. He hadn't kept her compliant with physical beatings. He had repeatedly, methodically convinced her that if she ever tried to escape, or if she ever fought back, he would simply drive down the mountain, find another young woman, and drag them down into the dark concrete room to suffer in her place. He had made her completely believe that countless innocent lives depended entirely on her absolute obedience. Claire had never tried to run away, not because she was completely broken, but because she had chosen to permanently sacrifice her own freedom to ensure that no one else would ever have to take her place in the dark. Her invisible prison was built entirely out of her own devastating, heroic compassion. Vance closed the heavy notebook. The tears openly flooded his eyes, falling softly onto the dusty concrete floor. He finally understood exactly why Claire had completely refused to acknowledge her own identity in Ohio. Even though the primary kidnapper was dead, the trusted volunteer had continued to send the Christmas cards, making her believe the terrifying promise was still in effect. She believed that if she came home, the volunteer would immediately kidnap another woman. Vance stood up, his sorrow instantly transforming into a massive, burning, unstoppable fury. He walked out of the concrete cell, gripping the hidden notebook tightly in his hand. The invisible strings of psychological manipulation had finally been completely severed. He had absolutely everything he needed to destroy the monster hiding in the sunlight. The sun was just beginning to rise over the Appalachian Mountains when Detective Arthur Vance returned to the quiet town of Oakhaven. He did not go to sleep, and he did not change his clothes. He drove his unmarked police cruiser directly into the affluent, manicured suburban neighborhood where the highly respected local volunteer lived. Vance parked across the street and watched as the volunteer walked out onto his front porch, holding a ceramic mug of hot coffee, enjoying the peaceful autumn morning. He looked completely relaxed, exactly like a man who believed his dark, terrible secrets were permanently buried. Vance stepped out of his cruiser. He did not bring a massive tactical team with flashing sirens. He wanted this to be quiet, personal, and absolutely inescapable. Vance walked up the concrete driveway, pulled his heavy steel handcuffs from his belt, and completely shattered the 19-year illusion. The volunteer was escorted into the windowless interrogation room at the state police headquarters. He sat at the metal table, attempting to maintain his flawless, confident facade. He politely asked Vance if there was some sort of misunderstanding regarding a local charity event. Vance did not say a single word. He simply opened a heavy cardboard folder and began laying the undeniable physical proof directly onto the metal table. First, he laid down the 19 custom-printed Christmas cards bearing the terrifying, single-sentence threat. Then, he placed the 1997 corporate security log, proving the volunteer had secretly left work for 2 hours on the exact afternoon of the abduction. Finally, Vance placed the heavy, worn composition notebook he had recovered from beneath the rusted mattress in the subterranean holding cell. The volunteer stared at Claire's hidden diary. All the color instantly drained from his face. His confident posture completely collapsed, his shoulders violently slumping forward. The flawless, trusted community leader was instantly reduced to a terrified, trembling coward. During the grueling, 3-hour interrogation, the volunteer finally confessed to the entire horrifying conspiracy. He wept, but his tears were not out of guilt or remorse for Claire. They were entirely born of self-pity. He admitted that his older brother, a deeply violent and reclusive man, was the primary kidnapper. On the afternoon of September 2, 1997, the volunteer had agreed to help his brother secure a massive, heavy piece of farming equipment. He drove a separate truck, following his brother down the rainy mountain road. When his brother suddenly used a little girl to trap Claire's sedan against the muddy ditch, the volunteer panicked. Instead of helping the innocent teacher, he used his own vehicle to block her car from reversing. The volunteer confessed that he knew exactly where his brother had taken her, but he was terrified that if he called the police, the massive scandal would completely destroy his own reputation, his business, and his standing in the town. So, he chose to protect his family name instead of an innocent woman's life. He became the invisible accomplice. He loudly led the civilian search parties, intentionally steering them away from his brother's isolated property. And when he saw the yellow sticky note inside the unsecure police cruiser, he casually reached into the box and stole it, ensuring the police would never identify his brother's truck. But the most devastating part of the confession perfectly explained Claire's current situation in Ohio. 6 years ago, the older brother suffered a massive, fatal heart attack. The volunteer panicked. He knew Claire was locked inside the subterranean cell. He drove up the mountain, unlocked the heavy steel door, and pulled her out of the dark. But he could not simply let her go. If she went to the police, she would eventually identify him as the man driving the second vehicle. So the volunteer utilized the massive psychological conditioning his brother had already established. He drove Claire across state lines into Ohio, setting her up with a new identity as Grace Miller. He told her that his brother was still alive, still watching her every single move, and still perfectly willing to replace her with another innocent victim if she ever tried to contact her family. The volunteer promised Claire that if she lived quietly and obeyed the rules, no one else would be hurt. To keep the invisible prison completely intact, the volunteer faithfully sent the custom Christmas cards every single year, ensuring Claire remained absolutely terrified of a monster who was already dead. With a full, recorded confession and the accomplice officially in federal custody, Detective Vance immediately boarded a flight back to Ohio. He walked into the secure safe house exactly at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Claire was standing nervously by the window, her hands shaking, her left thumb rubbing frantically against her index finger as she stared out into the empty street, waiting for the phantom to arrive. Vance walked gently into the room. He did not use the name Grace. "Claire," Vance said softly, "you don't have to look out the window anymore. No one is coming." Claire turned around, her green eyes wide with panic, terrified that Vance's presence would trigger the kidnapper's violent promise. Vance slowly walked over to the table and placed two pieces of paper down on the wood. The first was an official, state-certified death certificate for the older brother. The second was a photograph of the trusted volunteer, sitting in the interrogation room wearing heavy steel handcuffs. Vance looked directly into Claire's terrified eyes. His voice was thick with profound emotion and absolute certainty. "The man who took you died 6 years ago," Vance explained gently. "And the man who sent the cards is sitting in a permanent prison cell. They are entirely gone, Claire. The promise is broken. No one is watching you, and absolutely no one will ever be taken to replace you. You sacrificed 19 years of your life to protect innocent people. You saved them all. Now it is finally time to let us save you." Claire stared at the death certificate. She looked at the photograph of the handcuffed accomplice. The massive, suffocating psychological dam that had completely trapped her mind for nearly 2 decades finally, violently broke. The rigid, polite facade of Grace Miller completely shattered into a million pieces. Claire collapsed to her knees on the floor of the safe house, covering her face with her hands. A sound of raw, agonizing, completely overwhelming grief and absolute relief tore from the very bottom of her soul. She wept with a fierce, desperate intensity, mourning the 19 years that had been violently stolen from her, while simultaneously feeling the crushing, unbearable weight of the invisible concrete walls finally lifting off her chest. Vance knelt down beside her, gently placing his hand on her trembling shoulder, allowing her to cry until the absolute terror was entirely washed away. The very next morning, a state police vehicle drove quietly up the winding mountain roads, returning to the small town of Oakhaven. Robert and Mary Bennett were standing on their front porch. They were now in their late 60s, their hair completely white, leaning heavily against the wooden railing of the house they had absolutely refused to sell. The police cruiser slowly pulled into the driveway. The passenger door opened. Claire stepped out into the crisp mountain air. She looked at her childhood home, completely unchanged. And then she looked at the front porch. Burning brightly in the morning sunlight, exactly as it had every single day and night for 19 years, was the yellow porch light. "Mom, Dad," Claire whispered, her voice cracking as the heavy tears immediately flooded her eyes. Mary Bennett let out a loud, breathless cry. She stumbled off the wooden porch, running across the grass with a desperate, fierce strength she hadn't possessed in decades. Robert followed right behind her, tears openly streaming down his weathered face. They collided in the center of the driveway, wrapping their arms completely around their daughter. Claire buried her face into her mother's shoulder, holding onto her parents with absolute, crushing desperation. They wept openly, a tangled embrace of profound healing and indescribable joy. The endless nightmare of ambiguous loss was finally over. The porch light had guided her home. In the weeks that followed, the transition back into a world that had completely changed was incredibly difficult for Claire. She had to learn how to navigate modern technology, adjust to the passing of time, and slowly rebuild her sense of absolute safety. She moved back into her childhood bedroom, heavily protected and fiercely loved by her parents. But there was one final, massive emotional hurdle Claire knew she had to face before she could truly move forward. She needed absolute closure. On a quiet Saturday morning, Claire asked Detective Vance to drive her to Oakhaven Middle School. The aging brick building was completely silent, exactly as it had been on the afternoon she stayed late to finish decorating. Claire walked slowly down the empty, echoing hallway, her footsteps sounding loud against the polished linoleum floor. She stopped in front of the heavy wooden door of room 12. Her hands shook slightly as she reached out and pushed the door open. The classroom looked different. There were modern computers on the desks, and new educational posters lined the cinderblock walls, but the fundamental shape of the room remained exactly the same. Claire walked slowly toward the front of the room, standing directly next to the chalkboard. She looked up at the top right corner. hanging there, completely overlooked by years of janitorial staff, deeply faded by 19 years of sunlight and slightly curling at the edges, was a single, bright red paper apple. It was the exact apple she had carefully taped to the wall on the evening of September 2nd, 1997. Claire reached up and gently touched the faded red paper. The memories of that beautiful, perfect first day of teaching rushed completely back into her mind. She remembered the bright faces of the children, the smell of freshly sharpened pencils, and the profound, absolute joy she had felt standing in this exact spot. For the very first time in 19 years, the trauma completely faded into the background. She took a deep breath, looking out at the empty wooden desks, and quietly whispered the words that had haunted her for nearly 2 decades. "I remember telling them I'd see them tomorrow." Suddenly, the heavy wooden door of the classroom slowly opened behind her. Claire turned around. Walking into the quiet classroom was a tall, broad-shouldered man wearing a dark blue firefighter's uniform. It was Ethan. But Ethan was not alone. Following closely behind him, slowly filing into the small classroom, were dozens of full-grown adults. They were in their early 30s now. Some were holding the hands of their own young children. Some were wearing medical scrubs, business suits, and mechanic uniforms. They were her students. The entire class from room 12 had completely assembled. Claire stood completely frozen at the chalkboard, her hands covering her mouth, the heavy tears immediately spilling over her cheeks. Ethan walked to the front of the room, standing just a few feet away from the teacher who had completely changed his life. "You did see us," Ethan said, his voice thick with profound emotion, smiling warmly through his own tears. "You just took a little longer to get back." One by one, the grown adults walked up to the front of the room. They didn't treat her like a fragile, broken victim of a terrifying crime. They treated her exactly like the beloved, highly respected teacher she had always been. They shared incredible, heartbreaking stories about how her kindness on that single day had shaped their lives. A woman who was now a pediatric nurse told Claire how her gentle patience had inspired her to work with frightened children. Ethan told her how the book about fire trucks had given a quiet, forgotten boy the absolute courage to become a brave man. As Claire stood completely surrounded by the incredible, thriving adults her students had become, a massive, profound realization entirely washed over her soul. The predator had stolen 19 years of her physical freedom. He had locked her in a dark concrete room and forced her to live under a terrifying, manipulative lie. But as she looked at the beautiful lives standing inside room 12, she realized that the monster had absolutely failed to erase her. Her incredible compassion, her fierce protective instinct, and her profound love had echoed through the community for 2 decades, entirely without her knowing it. She had never stopped being a teacher. The investigation was officially, permanently closed. The trusted volunteer was convicted on massive federal charges of conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and aiding in a kidnapping, completely ensuring he would spend the absolute remainder of his natural life behind heavy steel bars. The subterranean cell deep in the Appalachian foothills was completely demolished by county excavators, violently tearing the concrete blocks out of the earth and burying the nightmare forever. Claire Bennett did not return to the classroom immediately. Healing from profound, extensive trauma requires massive patience and time, but she slowly began tutoring children in the local community, using her incredible empathy to help students who were struggling in the dark. The story of the young teacher who vanished after her very first day stands as a chilling, terrifying reminder that evil can hide perfectly in the bright sunlight, masking deep cruelty behind a trusted, respected smile. It proves that fear can build an invisible, suffocating prison long after the heavy steel doors are unlocked. But far more importantly, it remains an immortal, incredibly beautiful testament to the indestructible power of true compassion. A monster can steal a life, he can intercept the truth, and he can convince a hero that they are completely alone. But true kindness is an echoing, undeniable force. It survives in the quiet courage of a firefighter. It endures in the bright yellow porch light of a mother's unbreakable hope, and it waits patiently in a faded paper apple hanging on a classroom wall. Fear can hold a person captive for 19 years, but absolute truth and radical, unconditional love will always, eventually, lead them home.